Welcome to BoxTheBase, your home for boxing and baseball. And today I'm here with
Ely Sussman, the founder of FishOnFirst. Definitely here to talk the baseball part, not so much the boxing part.
yeah. Um, so I reached out to Eli because we're both, I'm gonna say, Marlins fans, and baseball season is right around the corner. So I'm really excited for the season to finally get started. But I think there's a lot of interesting things that can be talked about with the Marlins. It might sound very odd to use the word interesting because they didn't do a lot in the offseason in terms of players and trade. Well, they did make some trades, I guess, if you will, but I think there's still some good takeaways. We'll talk about the good. We'll talk about the bad. Um, so I want to go ahead and start off with just spring training. What I mean, I don't know if you've been to spring training this year, or if other guys on First on Fish have been out there, covering. But what has the vibes been like in general?
Yeah, you mentioned before how changes from last year, and even though it wasn't a super busy offseason, of course, it was a busy mid-season trade activity window. So for all the guys that were acquired during the deadline in July, this is their first spring training with the Marlins. So from that standpoint, that's made this spring a lot more exciting than I think the previous one, just because a lot of new faces either way. With them being so many prospects, a lot of young faces that are in big league camp for the very first time. Almost every day of camp, not every single one, but the vast majority of days we've had on-site coverage from Fish on First of going back to the workouts, but now the games themselves. Yeah. So the context is that the expectations around the team are pretty low this year. And when you put that aside, I guess it's been interesting. Ultimately, how it all goes together at the big league level, and it's hard to get like too focused on some of the position battles, and I guess the placing expectations on individual players is not so much of a big deal this year when you have guys that are so early in their career. You don't know when exactly they're going to put it all together. It's more so about just having them taking steps forward. From that standpoint, I think it's been more good than bad this spring. Ultimately, the most important thing is just getting through the preseason healthy. You see around the sport, like some of the biggest stars on other teams have had serious injuries this spring, and the Marlins, knock on wood, have been pretty fortunate from that regard. Not too many injuries whatsoever, and none that are really season threatening for these guys. As long as you get into the year with the guys that you actually care the most about, the ones that need that developmental time, that's the most important thing. So I think it's been a positive spring training for this team in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, and not only has there been a lot of new players, from either the deadline last year or just signing guys through minor league deals and stuff, but there's also prospects coming up, but also there's been a lot of change with the coaching staff. And I know the development of from the lowest point of minor league all the way up to the MLB has kind of had a shakeup, if you will. Um, and I mean, I think the biggest one that people will notice immediately is the new manager, Clayton McCullough, if I'm saying his name right. And I'm just curious what his identity with the team is, or what kind of identity he's trying to build in the clubhouse.
What he keeps reiterating is about how it's all about the players. It's all about putting the players in the best position to grow and to get better. How he is just really specific about wanting to customize everybody's development to come up with the drills that make the most sense for a certain player, to play them at the positions that best suit a certain player. He's just really invested. It's like being somewhat of a teacher of not to like demean these players, but it's almost like being an elementary school teacher where he's just really hands-on with individual guys to make sure that they have specific path to how they're going to be the best version of themselves and what they can be working on at this stage of the year in order to be significantly better as a player than they were coming into camp and how they were the previous year. He's an extremely nice guy, extremely friendly. I would say it's a different personality than what Skip had. Skip Schumacher, who was an extremely successful manager. I think I speak for a lot of people in saying that this team would be well off if Skip was still in charge. In some ways, though, at least Clayton knows who he is. He's not trying to be Skip. He's not trying to replace him. He's trying to be himself. It's a different personality than I think a lot of managers around the league, where he is just so friendly and so yeah. I mean, he just wants these. No matter what, I think the vibes are always going to be pretty positive around this team until maybe a few years down the road when they're competing for championships and there's a little more stress involved. For now, it's just like things couldn't get much worse than they were last season, right? When you lose 100 games, it felt like it took them forever just to win their first game of the season in 2024. So from that regard, I think that has been that's made spring very chill across the board. The fact that we're just looking to take a step forward from where the Marlins were last year, and that shouldn't be that hard to do, even with all the guys that are traded away, all the young players that are being put in these important situations. It's really hard to lose 100 games in back-to-back years. And as I mentioned, with from a health standpoint, that's going really well. That was such a big weight on this team last year, is all the pitchers specifically that went down due to injuries. If that luck just evens out a little bit, that in itself is going to make a significant difference.
Yeah, and I guess there are some people out there. I don't know how much it's been said on social medias or just in general through like the fan base, who might worry that they got rid of Skip, who was not brought in by Peter Bendix, and then he went and handpicked someone like Clayton. Is there any worry that he's kind of being puppeteered in a way, like he was brought in because he's just gonna follow the orders of everyone upstairs, or is that not really a worry to have?
I think that's a very fair point to make, Vic. Especially when you look at this coaching staff in particular and some of the guys that were hired. As you'd suspect, when it's a new manager coming in, they bring some of their own guys who they have personal history with and they know in some previous capacity. That's how you know you can trust them, even if they're in a new position they haven't been in before. With this staff, it is kind of split down the middle between guys that are typical McCullough guys and ones that are more associated with the front office, ones that have history specifically with Gabe Kapler. He's the assistant GM of this team. Before that, he was managing with the Giants. Some of the other candidates that were in the mix for the job before McCullough got it had Kapler connections. Just to name one on the even this current staff that is McCullough's staff, the hitting coach Eddie Guerrero. He was one that was previously tied to Kapler. He worked with Kapler on Kapler's major league coaching staff with the Giants, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I'm sure that Clayton had some sort of say in everybody involved with his staff, but he certainly didn't put it all together all by himself. It was a collaborative effort in that regard. And I do think that is going back to the differences in personality between him and Skip. Skip just had a whole lot of conviction in the decisions that he was making. He kind of wanted all that responsibility, and he wanted to deal with all the consequences of when those decisions don't work out. I think with McCullough, it is more collaborative as somebody that has been a minor league manager before, but that's a totally different job aspect, development wise, compared to the big leagues. And he wasn't even a bench coach with the Dodgers. He's coming over after having been a first base coach at the big league level, which is just a completely different set of responsibilities than what he has right here. He's looking for input from the rest of the organization, and that includes from the front office. And I do think that is, even though there's has to be a relationship there no matter who the manager is, I feel like there's going to be a stronger bond between Bendix and McCullough than there was, for example, between Skip and Bendix, considering that Bendix didn't even hire Skip in the first place.
Yeah. So now switching it over from the coaching staff to the players, I think one of the biggest things, well, it kind of ties back to the coaching staff because they let go of basically everybody. So one of the guys was Mel Stoudemire Jr., who a lot of people held in high regards as a good pitching coach. But one of the things I've even said it a lot on Twitter myself is that they've brought in a lot of drive line guys. There are a lot of pitch data guys. And I think you've seen some of that take place already in spring training. Some guys are throwing harder. Some guys have more movement, whether it's vertical break, whether it's just better pitch sequencing. Um, what has that been like for some of these players? I mean, I guess having extra data or just having access to that stuff and helping them pitch better.
Right. One common story you hear now from multiple guys is how this pitching organization includes the pitching coach himself, Daniel Moskis, the new pitching director, Bill Heasel, among others. It's another collaborative effort there. Specifically, they feel like there's a lot of untapped potential when it comes to breaking balls and specifically the sweeper, and that's a pitch that I think almost everybody on this staff now has either, if they already had it, then it's better than it used to be. If they didn't have it, then they've added it this offseason. Feeling like that is one area that, based in data, is an addition that a lot of pitchers can really benefit from. And so far, the results have been pretty good from that. You mentioned guys throwing harder. So I think that's a mix of things because really, Driveline, I would say its claim to fame is getting guys to throw harder, even when they're well into their professional careers, coming up with routines where they can add velocity in a way that you wouldn't usually expect them to. So that applies to most notably Ryan Weathers, to Max Meyer, two guys that Weathers himself already had a decent fastball last year, but it's now even harder than ever so far in spring training. And then Max had I'd say a disappointing year in all regards last year, in part because his fastball wasn't exactly what it had been advertised to be and what was supposed to be as a prospect. He has regained some of that through the conditioning work that he put in. There was some input from this Marlins brain trust in order to get him physically in a position where he could throw consistently in the mid 90s, unlike last year when he wasn't quite on that level. So from those two areas, in terms of adding new pitches and just throwing as hard as your body will safely allow you to, those have been tangible differences. So Mel was a genius when it came to pitching, and he would come up with he did things that made pitchers better as well across his, I think, 6 years as Marlins pitching coach. I would say that this is just more standardized, where you have a few different cooks in the kitchen instead of just one guy, instead of just one grand master. You have the collaboration between a few different people that kind of share a philosophy, but also it goes back to something I mentioned with McCullough about really customizing a plan for every player, looking at what that player does well, what they do poorly, and how you can work to their strengths to get the best version of themselves. And so far, I think the team, ERA wise, if you just look at the overall numbers this spring, it's actually pretty bad. But you look at the pitchers that they're really counting on taking steps forward, and most of them are heading in the right direction.
Yeah, and just to keep talking a little bit about pitching here, there was some news, Sandy coming out that his innings would be limited, but then he came out and said he hasn't heard anything about that. You also have guys like Ryan Weathers and Max Myers who dealt with some injury last year. Has there been like a definitive plan set out of how they're gonna use these starting pitchers? Are they gonna be like 5 and done? Is it gonna be based on how they're throwing? Do they have any set plan there?
Well, yeah, my read on it is that more so than previously, that the more new age thinking is kind of Sandy is kind of an outlier, kind of out of step with the new line of thinking, which is that you just focus on executing the best possible pitch as hard as you can throw it, and it's more about like being successful in each inning than it is to actually really build up your workload. I think overall what you're going to see is individual pitchers that don't get stretched out and pushed quite as much as they used to be, and it's more about relying on the entire ensemble, the entire group of pitchers that you have to come in and kind of fill in the blanks. If you go back to Bendix's background with the Tampa Bay Rays, I mean, that was a team that they had plenty of pitching injuries. They had plenty of young pitchers. They had all these guys that would pop up out of nowhere and be really effective. And I think that is some of what's carrying over to the Marlins, where they trust their group to get the best out of all these individual guys. But I don't think they're going to lean too heavily on any one in particular. I know everybody's excited about Sandy being back and starting on opening day. My prediction is that he goes like 5 innings on opening day. I think they're going to take a while to have him stretched out to do what he loves to do, which is to finish what he started. But that's partially due to coming back from the Tommy John. You could just look across all the history. Guys coming back from Tommy John, their first year back, even if health permitting, they make every scheduled start. They don't pitch as many innings as they did right before they got hurt. That's just the general science behind it. So I don't think they're setting a specific innings limit on him. But I do think they're going to handle him more tenderly than they did the previous couple of years before he got hurt. And that overall, it's going to be more about on the starting pitching side. You mentioned like the five and dive philosophy, and I do think that is going to be more common than we're used to seeing, where guys give everything they have those first couple times through the order, and then it's about turning it over to the bullpen and expecting them to throw up zeros. So that is my early prediction right there. Even though I don't think they want to come out and say it because that's not quite as fun. I think any baseball fan knows that the starting pitcher is a big selling point when you're talking about tuning into a certain game. And for them to, they don't want to like publicly that like push back against that. They still want fans, the few that do, they still want fans to come to the ballpark to see Sandy or to see whoever their favorite pitcher is. But yeah, I think realistically, you're not going to see a ton of complete games from the Marlins this season.
Yeah. And also, just to kind of wrap up this pitching segment here, probably the biggest talking point that has been going around, not just the Marlins, but across the league in general, is the possibility of Sandy Alcantara being traded. A lot of us as Marlins fans tend to just believe it's going to happen, whether it happens now or whether it happens at the deadline. It's inevitable. Like, we've all just kind of, I think, come to terms with that. And myself personally, I've played around, like I've used the chat GPT. I made a tweet about it yesterday, I believe, on a potential Sandy trade. And it sent him to the Baltimore Orioles, which was kind of interesting because the last player named in the trade always kept being somebody that was no longer on the Orioles. So don't use AI to make a trade, is what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
I personally of the Orioles or the Red Sox, because I like their farm system. Where do you stand with Sandy being traded?
I think that there's a 0% chance he's traded before the start of the season. He's going to, I think the team understands that for him to be as valuable as he can be on the trade market, he has to have regular season success again. And they believe in all their heart that he's going to be successful. So they're going to let him actually show it on the mound and prove himself. They know how, absolutely disastrous it would be from a fan standpoint to have him work all the way back from this injury and for his one of the better pitching careers that any Marlin has ever had, for it to end like in a couple weeks before the start of the season would totally destroy any fan interest in the entire product for the rest of this year and years to come. I think they understand that from a baseball standpoint and just from a community standpoint, it makes sense to have him go into the year and prove himself and hopefully be close to his Cy Young form during the first half of the season. But as the year goes on, and I think the assumption comes from the fact that, yeah, the Marlins are not expected to win many games this year. That they should be sellers very much like they were last year. And once they are, there's going to be so many teams that would be interested in Sandy. He is, I think it's likely that he'd be the very best available starting pitcher on the trade market from a bad team who's available to be acquired. He's somebody that contract wise, he would fit in with most other organizations in baseball. I think he's really good value based on the contract that he was signed to. So that just opens up such a wide group of potential suitors. That includes the Orioles. That includes small market teams, as long as any of those small market teams are actually kind of in the competitive mix. And it really helps that he's not going to be a free agent for a couple more years. It's 2 more guaranteed years and then a team option in 2027 that his new team would almost certainly pick up. It's really likely to happen just because of how far away this team is from being great. These are his prime years, we think, these next few years. And if they're not going to be able to take advantage of it by putting together a winning team, and if there's going to be so much interest in trying to acquire him across the league, you could get this really impressive bidding war and hopefully get multiple players back that you can really build around that next competitive team. But I think either way, it's going to be I think it's likely to happen this year. There is no rush just because of how long he's still under club control beyond this year. Um, but if this is the direction it's headed in, I'm sure everybody's going to be pretty bummed out about it just because he represented this organization so proudly. And he really took a lot of pride in being Marlin, and he's done such a good job when he's been healthy.
Yeah, and I mean, Sandy, I think, has said it himself in multiple interviews that he likes being in Miami, which, I mean, it would inevitably suck to see him go, but I think I would have to say that inevitably he will end up on another team if as soon as this year's deadline, trade deadline. And flipping it over to now the offensive side of the ball, um, there's been, I think, a lot of interesting positional battles throughout the spring, mainly in the outfield, some at first. But I just think it's I think the lineup, especially when it comes to like predicting an opening day lineup, is very difficult. You know, there's not a lot of guys that you know are gonna be where exactly. Like I would say Connor Norby is most likely gonna be at third. Then you have um, X Edwards is gonna be at shortstop, and then you have um, Otto Lopez who's gonna be presumably at second base. And most likely, since it's going to be Sandy throwing, I would guess if healthy and ready, it would be Nick Fortes behind the plate, just because he's probably the most familiar with him out of all the catchers that have been in spring training camp. But how do you view the offense currently as it stands?
As we're speaking, they're on a hot streak over the past week in spring training. They've been averaging like 10 runs a game over the last 4 games. Overall, that doesn't change my view of them that much. It's one that's going to be lacking a lot of power, that has, aside from Edwards, there's not a ton of base stealing upside either, as well. It's just they're going to be relying on making more contact ins. I think the key way that they hope to improve compared to last year, and I think they will improve, is just being more disciplined and taking more walks, getting into more favorable counts. Where I think some players underperformed last year because they were just too aggressive and trying to do too much, chasing outside the zone. That's going to be key. I think any way you slice it, any way you put together these players, it's probably going to be a below average offense because they're relying on so many guys that have less than a year of big league experience. Even the ones that had success last year, like Edwards, like Norby, the league is going to adjust to them. Like Jonah Bride. Jonah Bride had so much success the second half of last year, but now their opponents have more information about the pitches they do damage against, the areas of the strike zone that they're best at and they're weakest at. I think there's going to be an adjustment there. Maybe one of those guys continues what they did last year. I think the others are going to take a step back. And you didn't mention the outfield, and I think for good reason, because it's hard. Jesus Sanchez is going to be in the opening day outfield. In terms of everybody around him, it's anybody's guess, just because I think this team is going to be platooning at that position as well as at first base. It's going to be depending on whether it's a right-handed pitcher or a left-handed pitcher, and that these guys are going to be splitting playing time until one of them shows that they can actually hit from both hands, both opposing pitcher types. So it is going to be kind of difficult to see how it all fits together. But you did mention the guys that should be near the top of the order. Edwards is going to be batting leadoff, and we think Norby is going to be pretty high up there. Not sure what they're going to do with Otto batting order-wise. But it's, yeah, I think one of the individuals that stood out this spring so far has been Matt Mervis, who has been terrible in the big leagues to this point in his career. But last year in particular, he was really held back by a hand injury. And there's reason to believe that there was a lot more power in there than he showed last season in the majors and even at AAA. And so far, so good this spring in terms of him actually leading the team in home runs. He should be somebody that's in the lineup almost every single day, especially against right-handed pitching. Whether he'll be successful as an all-around hitter, I don't know, but that's going to be an important power source, especially with Jake Berger departing, among others, in the offseason.
Yeah, and I mean, like I was saying before, I think there's been a lot of positional battles in general, but where where do you think like the most interesting position battles come from? Because I think there's a few options at catcher. You know, I don't know. Probably Joe Mack doesn't start the year with the big league team. I don't think so, but he maybe gets called up later in the year if there's an injury, maybe, or if something else happens. I mean, they're gonna need a secondary catcher either way, which I think will end up being Augustin Ramirez, who can split time with Nick Fortes as a catcher. Like you said, Matt Mervis is a good, pencil him in at first base. Um, but I think it's just, I mean, the outfield is also another interesting one. But you have certain guys like Sanoha who can come off the bench and maybe play a few different positions. Do you think they utilize any guys like that? I mean, I know they recently also sent what's his name from the Jake Berger trade, Max Acosta, to the minor league camp,
Yeah.
and and he's somebody who I think could play a few different positions as a utility guy. Do you think they like take stock in those players and utilize certain guys that can play multiple positions?
You mentioned Sonoha, so he's an interesting one for me because he has the most versatility out of anybody in terms of being able, even last year in a small sample showed he could play second base and shortstop and center field and left field. So that's kind of rare for somebody that young to have so much experience at all those different positions. And I'm not sure at this moment whether he's making the opening day roster. So that's one I'm watching carefully just because he played really well at AAA last year and he hit so well that you wonder if they want to give him a chance to still develop as a possible everyday player, or whether they're ready to kind of cast him in the smaller job as a utility guy. So I go back and forth in terms of what to do with him, whether it makes sense to have him as the main utility guy on the big league roster, or whether he should be at AAA and just wait for consistent playing time to open up in the majors. I'm not really sure. Uh, I think you can make arguments both ways that he's ready for the big leagues, but at the same time, in terms of his best, give him a chance to continue to improve at AAA until a regular job opens up. So in terms of him and the effects it has on the rest of the roster, because it's going to be a choice between somebody like him and maybe Eric Wagner, playing only part time and as a split deal where he could be sent to the minors, but has more power without the same versatility. It's like an interesting choice where they can organize this roster a few different ways to fill it out. It's a mix between whether to turn it over to the prospects or whether to use these guys that I would call stopgap players, ones that you just picked up off the scrap heap and think have some potential but aren't really counting too much on. As we get later into the year, I think the roster is going to get even younger. It's already is one of the youngest in baseball, no matter how they put it together. As the year goes on, you will see Agustin Ramirez make his debut at some point. I think you'll likely see Max Acosta get called up during the year if there's playing time available. But it's kind of crowded in the infield, whereas in the outfield is, as I mentioned, there's really a lot of moving parts. Um, but as the year goes on, a lot of the guys that they have acquired in those recent trades, the ones that aren't yet on the big league roster, they're going to continue to show up. And yeah, the success of the team will have a lot to do with how quickly those guys get acclimated to the majors for the first time.
Yeah, and another thing is just their overall offensive identity because they ever since like guys like Ozuna, Yelig, Stanton, Real Muto, ever since those guys left the team, I feel like they haven't had other than maybe like a Soler or some guys like Josh Bell and Jake Berger here and there, they haven't truly had elite power in the lineup consistently. Every season, it's like who's gonna be the guy to come up with power? You know, who's gonna hit the home runs for the Marlins? Because it's a lot of moving pieces every year for this club, and they don't have a consistent power guy. But to me, I've always said that they should look for guys that just make solid contact because they have a lot of green in the outfield. I feel like when you see the stadium, there's a lot of gaps in the outfield, and whether it's putting a ball down the line, whether it's a ball in between the center fielder and the left fielder, the center fielder and the right fielder, and you can find a lot of doubles. And if you have a certain guy with speed, doesn't need to be crazy speed, just a little above average. Maybe he legs it out into a triple. You know, what kind of identity do you think they're going to bring this year in terms of their offense?
Yeah, I generally agree with that. What I want to point out is 2 years ago in 2023, that team was assembled with a lot of contact hitters and it's conflicted because obviously that team made the playoffs. That was a very successful team, but actually didn't score very many runs that year with all those contact hitters. They came through in a lot of clutch situations. Um, so that is a wrinkle to it in baseball these days where late in games, it is extra important to have guys that could put balls in play against really nasty relievers that are just trying to strike everybody out. That is part of it, but I do agree with the speed part where yeah they just haven't had a ton of that. It's been a few different guys like it was Jazz in recent years and Xavier Edwards towards the end of last year. But most players on this team were actually not very aggressive as base stealers. And that I'd like to see change a little bit. We haven't really seen a ton of that this spring, to be honest, in terms of stolen base attempts. There are particular guys I think have more potential there. Connor Norby in particular, even though he hasn't been a base stealer for much of his pro career, you just look at the measurables on his sprint speed, how quickly he gets down the line. I think Norby has a lot more potential to steal bases than he previously did. So that's one guy. Otto Lopez did a decent amount of that last season, and he should be getting even more playing time than the year before. So that should help Otto taking another step forward compared to where he was last season. And yeah, generally speaking, some of the other guys we've already touched on have a decent amount of speed. I think Acosta stole over a couple of years ago, stole over 40 bases. So he has some experience that doing that as well, getting the green light and taking advantage of it. It should be mentioned that Clayton McCullough, as the first base coach with the Dodgers, that was one of the strengths of his coaching background, is his ability to teach base runners. Shohei Ohtani is somebody that, of course, started stealing bases at a high volume for the very first time. Not a coincidence in his first year and only year working with McCullough. So I think that is the one like specific area, as somebody that was a former catcher and kind of knows what to look for on the defensive side when preparing against base runners. I think he has a good perspective, and he could get guys. He could teach them the fundamentals they need to get the most out of their speed.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just overall talking about the offense, I think you definitely look at like guys who are probably going to be standouts in this lineup. You have guys like Xavier Edwards, Connor Norby, Otto Lopez. I mean, I think Nick Fortes, if he can continue what he did in the second half of last season, could be a standout. Maybe certain guys like Jesus Sanchez. But where do you think this team is truly gonna like thrive? Because it's not gonna be a very great team on paper. You know, they're probably gonna have to execute a lot on defense. They're gonna have to pitch their way to close games possibly. They might have nights where a lot of guys aren't hitting and they need to, rely on the pitching or their defense. Where do you think overall, not just offensively, but as a unit, as a complete team, where this team is gonna find their identity truly?
It goes back to what you mentioned before on the pitching side and developing these pitchers to be the best versions of themselves. That is what it's going to lean on. That's kind of the key to the Marlins the previous few years when things were going well, is about their starting pitching. And I think it's going to be a larger group of guys, as mentioned before, not leaning as much on Sandy as they did pre-Tommy John. It's about going to be the group as a whole, just being better at pitch design, being better at conditioning, and striking more guys out. That'll be part of it as well. Where we touched on some of the individual guys that I think are going to have an uptick in strikeout rate, such as Ryan Weathers, such as Max Meyer, because they have deeper pitch mixes now, because they have better quality fastballs for the rest of their repertoires to kind of work off of. That's going to be a pretty big key. We shouldn't forget about Yuri Perez, because every expectation is that he's going to be back during the second half of the season. And if he can be who he was right before he debuted, he was one of maybe the most promising young pitcher in all of baseball at that time. And I think he still has all the ingredients to be special in that regard. So I think that is going to be the separator for them, if this is going to be a more competitive team than expected for this year, but even more so for 2026 and beyond. And if, as anticipated by both of us, if Sandy gets traded, to how to fill the Sandy void is by developing these pitchers in a way that I don't think anybody's ever going to replicate that workload that he used to give, going well over 200 innings, but there can be guys that can match him in terms of missing bats. If they are throwing almost as hard, and if they are developing their secondary pitches to be so nasty and so consistent, I think this is going to be the one pillar of the organization that they're going to lean on the most, is trying to develop starting pitchers that can just dominate all by themselves when things are really clicking for them.
Yeah, and another thing I wanted to talk about and touch up on is, I mean, we've seen it with Peter Bendick since he arrived. His identity has been collect as many collect as many prospects in general. They don't necessarily have to be super top prospects, but just as many prospects in general. Who do you think are some of the guys that could be like next man up. Like let's say, knock on wood, because I don't want to make this example, but somebody gets injured and they need to call somebody up. Who like I think of guys like Joe Mack, Augustin Ramirez, Max
Yeah.
Acosta, even somebody that's not a very exciting name anymore because I think of the way San Diego handled him, but Graham Pauley. Then you have guys like Robbie Snelling on the pitching side, Adam Mazzaro, maybe Dax Fulton, even though I know he's coming off of injury and stuff. But who are just some of the names that you think would be like next man up to get a call up?
Well, you touched on a bunch of them right there. There's only so much I can add when you like name all the top 10 prospects that are major league ready. You did a very good job. I'd have to start with Agustin Ramirez for sure. He's had a very good camp on the offensive side, not just in terms of the power, but I think he has the hardest hit ball by any Marlin in the spring, but just the quality of the at bats. He is great at recognizing pitches and knowing what to swing at, what not to swing at, and then when he does swing, he does great
not
damage
to
against.
not to cut you off here, but speaking of Ramirez, I've seen his swing, and if he gets called up, I'd be worried for some of those major league catchers because some of them like to stand a little closer to the plate. I feel like he's gonna catch a lot of them with his backswing.
Yeah, he does have that pretty big finish on his swing that is it can be a bit of a hazard. From watching him, I don't think I've ever seen an opportunity in the minors where he actually bumped into somebody, but that is a concern. I think catchers are going to have to prepare for that when he's actually at the plate. I think he's going to be the most complete hitter for this team moving forward. That when he debuts, whether that success comes right away, I don't know, but I think in the near future, early in his career, that he's going to establish himself as a middle of the order bat that can play every single day. I'm not a big fan of his defense, but I'm a big fan of his bat. So whether that's being the everyday DH or being the main DH and the backup catcher on days when he's not DHing, I think he's going to be successful in the big leagues. It's so important considering the context where they acquired him. He was the top guy in the Jazz trade, a trade that was understandably pretty unpopular. And I think he's somebody that there's the potential if everything goes right that he could be about as valuable a player as Jazz was. And for them to have somebody that fits better with their timeline to compete than Jazz did, I think that would be a big win for Bendix to make that kind of bold deal and actually get good value from it. So he's right there just because he spent so much of last year already at AAA and had success there. And you mentioned Robbie Snelling, who I was pretty high on after watching him the second half of last year. They bought low on him. He had been awesome in 2023 with the Padres, and then he had slumped throughout the first half of 2024. They were still willing to trade him at that time, and he came over to the Marlins, and his command is what really stuck out to me, is how he was constantly getting ahead in counts and really dotting the corners with all of his pitches in a way that I think if he throws his fastball a little bit harder, and this year he's actually working on an additional slider that he didn't have before, that I see a path to him being like a long-term piece of this rotation. He should definitely be called up at some point this year. He just got to AAA at the very end of 2024, so they're not going to rush it. They'll have to perform a little bit in Jacksonville in order to show that he's fully ready for that opportunity. But once he comes up, I think he's going to be very good. We didn't mention Davison De Los Santos, and he continues to be, I think, the most divisive prospect in this organization because he put up amazing numbers last year between AA and AAA. He led the minors with 40 home runs last season. Most of that came before he was traded over to Miami, and he did quietly struggle down the stretch in AAA, where he hit amazing home runs every once in a while. But it's a lot different from Ramirez in that he just doesn't seem to recognize pitches quite as well as you'd like. And that's something that, because he's so young, he's still just 21 years old, maybe he can learn it. And I think this is where people are divided in terms of whether he just has a bad approach and he'll always struggle to get on base, or whether he can make something will click where he'll actually be able to get himself into better counts and show off that awesome power that he has. So with him, it's tricky because we mentioned Mervis earlier. And if Mervis has the kind of breakout year that he's capable of, then they won't have an obvious opening at first base. But he's somebody that I'm going to be watching very closely, De Los Santos, just because he is one adjustment away. It's a big adjustment, but he's one adjustment away from being just as exciting as Ramirez and being a really complete hitter. And then elsewhere on the pitching side, I think, most of those other ones are still a little while away. Thomas White is the clear top prospect in this
Yeah.
organization. He's about to pitch in the spring breakout game again, and I can't wait for that. Uh, by all accounts, just not just the measurable stuff, but in terms of the intangible stuff, he checks all the boxes you want as somebody that I think he's going to develop into a top of the rotation sort of pitcher. I think it's really unlikely that he debuts this year, just because this team is going to want to save his service time in club control a little bit longer. He's only 20 years old. I just say that because he might be ready by the second half of this year. I think with other organizations, you might actually see him debut if he was over there, just because he was so close already to being a complete pitcher. So I hope he starts the year at AA. That hasn't been confirmed yet, but he's either going to start there or get there very early in the year. And he's going to be just as exciting as I remember when following Ely at AA a couple of years earlier, I think in 2022, how awesome that was. Thomas White is really close to being at that level. He's not as much of a physical freak as Ely. He's not quite as tall. He's 6'5" instead of 6'8". He is otherwise, it's somebody that has very similar potential that is so hard to find. And for him to have improved so much from where he was just after getting drafted less than 2 years ago, that speaks to so much about how how dedicated he is to be the best version of himself.
Yeah, and then another guy who we both didn't mention, which I think makes sense, is Jared Serna, if I'm saying his name right, the second baseman, maybe shortstop, who came in the Jazz trade as well with Augustin Ramirez. Ramirez is the more MLB ready player currently, but I think a lot of people out there are excited about Serna because he has the most potential out of those players in that trade. Is there any possibility he debuts this year? Because the way I think of it is I'm like a little 50-50. If he plays good enough to just demand his way up, they might do it. But I also think that you have guys like Graham Pauley, Max Acosta, other guys who can play instead of starting certain service time so early.
Yeah, you laid it out pretty well, where he is on the 40-man roster already, the same way that Augustin Ramirez is. A lot of these other guys are. So that is in his favor. Anybody that's on the 40-man is a candidate to be called up at some point during the year, just because of injuries, because of potential trades. With him, he didn't even taste AA until getting traded over to the Marlins, and he did well the second half of last year. It's just that yeah, he still could benefit from a lot of reps in the minors. There's no hurry with him. I am a big believer in him. I think that despite his size, he's only like 5'7", that there is solid power in there, believe it or not. He has the ability to play multiple positions. They're going to try to give him a shot at shortstop, I think. They did option him down. If I can double check this, he's going to start the year at AA. That is the plan right now, being optioned to Pensacola for now. And I think largely that's to get him regular opportunities at shortstop, where he'll play shortstop there. Acosta will play shortstop mainly at AAA. So I think any way you slice it, Acosta is ahead in line of him, even though I think Serna might be the better overall prospect. Acosta is just closer because he spent all of last year at AA. He played in the fall league as well and did a good job down there right before getting traded over when he was still with the Rangers. So I just think he's behind Acosta in line, but because of his versatility, there's a few different ways that he could find himself up in the big leagues. I would lean towards no for this year. I feel like he's going to more likely debut in 2026. But he is, when we combine him with Ramirez, yeah, I think both those guys are ones that have been even better than expected from the time that their names were included in the trade. I think both of them have boosted their stock a little bit.
Yeah, and another aspect I want to talk about is, are there any guys on this roster who are going to make the MLB roster? Like, we know for certain they will. Guys like maybe Edward Cabrera or Jesus Sanchez, just to name a few names, where the team is kind of like little by little giving them a shorter leash is what I'm trying to say. Where it's like, if you don't perform this year, there's a possibility you're out. Because like I mentioned the guys like Jesus Sanchez and Cabrera, because Edward Cabrera is somebody who, coming up to the minor league, some people said he had a higher potential than even Sandy. He hasn't really reached it. There's a nice where everything is working and you see like amazing strikeout stuff, and he's amazing. He looks like a top five pitcher in the league. And then there's nights where he's giving up 5 walks before he even reaches the third. Similar happens with Jesus Sanchez, where it's like there's nights where he goes 3 for 4 and hits monstrous home runs, and you're like, this guy is the next, I don't know, Julio Rodriguez or Ronald Acuna. And then there's nights where he goes 0 for 4 and he just looks like he has no idea what he's doing. Are there any other guys that maybe are on thin ice on this roster, or not really because they're in a rebuild?
Right. Cabrera is the one that I think stands out the most among those. And part of the reason why I think that's how they feel is because he was somebody that was in trade talks last offseason, not this past year, but the year before, heading into 2024. They were willing to trade him back then. They got into negotiations to do so. And all things considered, last year was okay from him. I mean, he missed more time due to injury. He got off to a really slow start, and then he finished off pretty solidly, actually, the second half of the year. I've been kind of low on him throughout, where despite the, as you mentioned, the amazing stuff, the raw stuff that stands out and makes you dream about his potential. I mean, it's always been clear to me that there are just a few pieces missing from the overall puzzle, that I just don't think he can repeat his delivery consistently enough to be a good strike thrower, that he's always going to have issues working deep into games because he's getting into deep counts, that as unique as his changeup is and as deep as his pitch mix is, like there's just no consistency really in terms of how he utilizes those pitches together. His fastball itself is something that he's never really had a ton of trust in his fastball. And in my opinion, just doesn't use it enough in order to be the best version of himself, so that he's constantly relying on his secondary stuff in a way that I think makes him underperform who he should be. And yeah, so far this spring, there hasn't been anything all that new. We pointed to a couple other pitchers this year that arrived at camp with something specific they were working on and got better at over the offseason. And with him, it's the same old guy. And so far the results have been awful in spring training. But even outside of that, yeah, I don't know what the next step is for him to be better. I don't see the path to improvement, despite the raw ingredients that look pretty good. You need somebody that still has trade value, right? Whether it's right now or whether it's as long as he stays healthy. I think there are other teams that might still be willing to take a chance on him as a starter. In my opinion, I would just focus on having him become the best possible reliever that he could be, moving forward. And the Marlins themselves, it seems like he's going to be in that opening day rotation. So he's going to get another chance. He's gotten so many chances. He's going to get another one to maybe take a step forward. I just don't feel that he's been as coachable as you want a player to be, where whether it was Mel in previous years or whether it's this new group that's handling pitching development, yeah, he has not stood out as somebody that is really receptive to what others have to say in a way that would make him better. So yeah, overall, it's been kind of disappointing compared to the prospect hype that he initially had a few years ago.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I just think it's always been a little disappointing with Cabrera because I watch him pitch and I'm like, in my opinion, he has one of the best changeups across the whole league. But if he doesn't have a good fastball, if he doesn't have anything to work off of it, he can throw it all day and nobody's gonna swing at it. You know, it's just gonna play out that way. Um, is there any hitter that would fall into that category, like who's on thin ice, who's if he doesn't perform this season is kind of on his way out, or not really?
Even though we just got here, I feel like Kyle Stowers is on a considerable amount of pressure already. He was somebody that had decent prospect type himself with the Orioles a couple of years ago. They just traded for him, but he was the clear second piece of that package behind Connor Norby. Norby clearly has a long leash to prove himself, but Stowers there really were not a lot of bright spots from him at all the second half of last year. He's a little older than you'd think. He is 27 years old already. He does have a minor league option left, where that's the difference between somebody like him and Cabrera. Cabrera literally out of options, can't be sent down to the minors. Stowers, they at least have that option to use on him. It's just that the issues he had just making contact last year, and the weren't a whole lot of standout skills. Where he's somebody he could fake it in center field, he could kind of move around well, but he's not going to add a whole lot of value to the team unless he hits, unless he actually makes contact. And so far this spring, I don't know if there's really been much of a step forward compared to where he was last year. They have a lot of options when it comes to, especially in the corner outfield spots moving forward. And I think he's going to be on the opening day roster for the moment. That's not totally locked in either, just because him and Griffin Conine, they have a lot of similarities. And if there's a tiebreaker, Conine is the one that has a little more raw power, and he's certainly one that has played better so far this spring. Um, and then the next in line, whenever Victor Mesa Jr. gets healthy, that's another corner outfielder in the mix. It's pretty easy to find these other options at that position, especially if you have serious questions about your hit tool. With Stowers, I think he's going to have, if he, we'll see for sure whether he even makes the roster. I think he probably will, but even if he does, he's going to have to perform. Probably, I don't see him being like an everyday player even early on in the year. He's somebody that has a lot of work to do to earn regular reps. And I think if he gets off to a really slow start, that's similar to what happens middle of last summer, that it might only be a few weeks into the season where he gets sent down and swapped out with a different outfielder. So even though he just arrived recently, I think you have to be underwhelmed by what he's done since coming over in the trade.
Yeah, and just to wrap up here the video, the episode right at the end, I'd want to do what usually goes trending around on social media before opening day for a lot of teams, which is a little bit of a prediction, like record prediction, who's going to be Team Cy Young, who's going to be Team MVP, most improved, all of those, and just a little rundown from you to give your prediction on this team.
Yeah, that reminded me that coming up soon on Fish on First, we got to record our bold predictions episode where we really reach on some things. In this case, I'll try to go down the middle and try to give you my honest thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, because to me, it's like I'm not very good at predicting record per se, so I'm gonna leave that one out. But I think I'm gonna agree with a lot of people that I think Sandy's probably gonna be the Cy Young of this team for however long he is on this team this season. I mean, I'm really torn between a few players that I think would be like MVP of the team, but I'm gonna go with Connor Norby just because I think he has the tools there. Hopefully some of these new development teams can find something. And he has a new batting stance, so maybe that helps him. And overall, I just think it's gonna be a very interesting season. And I think one last thing I'm going to add that not a lot of people mention is what I think, and you can answer this question too after, is what would lead to them having a successful season. And I think it's not going to be in terms of wins. And this team isn't going to be a playoff team, so you're not going to find success there. But I think what makes a successful team is a lot of these guys that you've brought in over the last year or two start performing and showing a bit of their potential. Guys like Connor Norby really step up and show his potential. Maybe even Jesus Sanchez unlocks something new. Maybe Matt Mervis, has a little bit of a breakout season. Maybe you have guys like Edwards who takes the next step and can steal you, 60 bases, and he becomes a true stolen base threat. Otto Lopez just keeps developing his game and becomes even more of a diamond in the rough, finding. That's what I think. It's a lot of the core young players that are going to stick around for the next 2, 3, maybe even 4 years, start showing a little bit of their potential starting this year. That's what I think will turn this into a successful season.
Yeah, I'm not afraid to give a record prediction. I do think the record will improve compared to last year, just because it is hard. Even if you're trying to lose, it's hard to lose 100 in multiple years in a row. And I do think that the pitching staff is going to take a significant step forward compared to last year. And the offense can't take that much of a step back, even with all this youth movement and experience. It's hard to be much worse than they were last year. Even defensively especially, there's nowhere to go but up after really giving away so many unnecessary runs with both errors and mental lapses last year. I would put them at about 69 wins, 69 and 93, 7-game improvement from last year based on how things currently line up. I'd agree on Sandy being the likely Cy Young, unless you want to factor in the likelihood of him getting traded. Then I think that opens the door for Ryan Weathers to, over the course of a whole season, to add more value to the team overall, just because he has the opportunity to. I think he's going to be even better than he was in 2024. Yeah, on the position player side and like an MVP pick, I think the safest one to go with is Edwards. What he showed as a base runner last year and his knowledge of the strike zone, he's going to get on base and he's going to cause a lot of havoc there. Even if the batting average comes down from last year. And I do think his defense could be a little bit better, is a little bit better than it was last season based on what he was working on this offseason. So the key question with him is whether he spends the whole year at shortstop or whether they wind up moving him to second base. Now we'll see how that plays out. And the last, in terms of overall successful season, I'd have to agree that, especially on the hitting side, the key is going to be several guys establishing themselves as pieces you can build around. You really don't have much of anything as a major league organization if you don't have some reliable hitters to build around. With the rate that pitchers get injured, with the limitations on individual workload, like pitchers just it's hard to build around individual guys as face of your franchise. I mean, Sandy is a great example where he's almost everything you could want from a pitcher, and yet their franchise has been so inconsistent with more bad than good during his tenure. You really need guys that you could count on riding in the lineup every single day. At this moment, I don't think there's a single hitter that you can say, wow, or he's definitely going to be somebody that the Marlins build around for this next half decade or so. For a couple of those guys to emerge, whether it is Edwards or Norby or Augustine Ramirez, um, or somebody that I'm not even thinking of, somebody that surprises and breaks out this year, that's going to be huge because you need those guys to really break out before you even honestly start planning for a competitive future. It starts with those guys making the successful jump to the majors and conquering the adjustments that their opponents try to make. And that's what I'm going to be following this year, to have hopefully multiple hitters that firmly establish themselves as part of the team's long-term plans.
Yeah. So I think that'll wrap up this episode. I want to once again thank Eli for joining me and talking Marlins. I love talking about the Marlins. I could probably go weeks on end without stopping. But for this episode, that'll end it right here. Make sure to subscribe here on Box the Base. I'm going to make sure to link all of Eli's accounts, First on Fish, down below. So go check them out if you like the Marlins. And even if you don't like the Marlins and you're just a baseball fan and you want to keep up with the league, they do amazing coverage over there for Marlins. And yeah, thank you all for tuning in. I'll see you guys next week.